And starting off at number 10, we have Magikarp Wailord GX, a card tied with another Tag Team GX Pokemon as the basic Pokemon with the highest HP. For 5 Water Energy, Super Splash does 180 damage. For 1 Water Energy, the Towering Splash GX attack does 10 damage, but if you have a total of 8 Water Energy attached to Magikarp Wailord GX, it also deals 100 damage to each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. 2 attributes of this card immediately make it stand out. It's, to this day, incredible HP, and the bonus effect of Towering Splash. The most boring, and at times effective, role that Magikarp Wailord GX fills was its use in various stall decks thanks to its near inability to be knocked out in a single hit. For the standard format of Sun and Moon through Unbroken Bonds, Wall Stall, a deck full of annoying to KO Pokemon, was a viable control deck and loved repeatedly healing Magikarp Wailord GX with its Max Potion to prevent your opponent from taking any prize cards. This strategy was especially effective against Pokemon which couldn't even 2-hit KO the massive tag team. Staple cards like Zoroark and Lycanroc GX, for example, posed no real threat to Magikarp Wailord GX. The second deck that could utilize Magikarp Wailord GX were those which could power up its attack easily. In the standard format, this limited its playability exclusively to Quagsire decks that could accelerate energy onto the board with Naganadel and then move it to the active spot with Washout. This deck could only put a maximum of 4 energy into play in a single turn, so Towering Splash functioned more as an attack to close out games or punish slowly set of opponents after chipping down their higher HP Pokemon with Super Splash. In the expanded format, the Tag Team Pokemon could be paired alongside Blastoise and Archie's Ace in the Hole to quickly attach 8 energy to Magikarp Wailord GX for potential turn 1 Towering Splash and a frequent turn 1 Super Splashes. Unfortunately, both of these decks either never reached the top of the meta or very quickly fell out of the top meta. Quagsire Naganadel decks required a lot of setup to function properly and was seen as a rogue deck. Archie's Blastoise expanded format decks were very strong, especially when Magikarp Wailord GX was the only legal tag team Pokemon due to having received a promo printing before the release of all the other tag team Pokemon. Once Pikachu and Zekrom released though, the deck plummeted in viability. Regardless, all this doesn't mean Magikarp Wailord GX is a bad card. It really goes to show the overall power level of tag team Pokemon when a card that's seen as much competitive usage as Magikarp Wailord GX is at the top of the list of the worst tag team Pokemon. And at number 9, we have Celebi Venusaur GX. This tag team Pokemon was the face of a tanky, healing-oriented strategy that briefly existed when tag team Pokemon were first introduced to the Pokemon TCG. For 1 Grass and 2 Colorless Energy, Hazard Pollen dealt 50 damage and left your opponent's active Pokemon burned, confused, and poisoned. For those unaware, a poison Pokemon has 1 damage counter placed on it between turns. A burned Pokemon has 2 damage counters placed on it between turns, and then the burned Pokemon's controller flips a coin. If they win the coin flip, their Pokemon is cured of the burn. Confusion is slightly different in that its damage only happens when you try to attack. When a player wants to attack with a confused Pokemon, they flip a coin. If they win the flip, their attacks work as normal. If they lose the flip, their Pokemon takes 30 damage and doesn't attack. All of these status conditions racked up extra damage on your opponent's active Pokemon in between turns if they couldn't switch their Pokemon from the active spot for some reason. This Pokemon's second main attack, Solar Beam, is far simpler, dealing 150 damage for 2 Grass and 2 Colorless Energy. Rounding out Celebi Venusaur GX's effects, we have its Evergreen GX attack. For 2 Grass and 2 Colorless Energy, the attack dealt 180 damage and healed all damage from this Pokemon. In addition, if Celebi Venusaur GX had an extra Grass Energy attached to it when using the attack, all cards from your discard pile were shuffled into the deck. This attack, like all other GX attacks, could only be used once per game. The combination of annoying status conditions, a monstrous 270 HP, and a once per game full heal that shuffled your entire discard pile back into the deck made Celebi Venusaur GX an extremely difficult Pokemon to KO, if you couldn't take it out in a single attack. Hazard Pollen's status condition damage slowly stacked onto Pokemon that couldn't easily get out of the active spot, bringing them into range of a lethal Solar Beam. Any small chip damage dealt to Celebi Venusaur GX could be consistently recovered by a plethora of healing cards, such as multiple bench Shaman, mixed herbs, Life Forest, and even Potion. Once all of these healing cards were exhausted, Evergreen GX put them back into the deck to be reused again while fully healing at the same time. During the first ever tag team format, the Sun and Moon through Team Up standard format, Celebi Venusaur GX was considered a decent rogue option into the metagame. Decks such as Zapdos Pikarom and non-control Zoroark variants could struggle to deal meaningful damage through healing cards. Sadly though, Celebi Venusaur GX fell out of the competitive metagame completely following the release of the next tag team set featuring a high damage fire type in Reshiram Charizard GX, better known as Reshizard. This Pokemon consistently one-shot Celebi Venusaur GX thanks to the latter's fire type weakness, invalidating the tanking healing strategy that Celebi Venusaur decks were built around. Reshizard's popularity killed any shot this card had at being competitively viable. Celebi Venusaur GX is not a bad card. In fact, many of the cards on this list have seen some kind of competitive success, but its poor matchup leading to no competitive usage gets it a spot towards the top of this list. And at number 7, we have Reshiram Zekrom GX, a card that was massively hyped to be a top meta threat when first revealed, only for the card to have no competitive success in the standard format. For 1 fire and 1 electric energy, Fabled Firebolt deals 90 damage for each basic fire or electric energy you discard from your bench Pokemon when you use the attack, with a maximum of 3 energy being discardable. This damage cap rarely mattered against GX Pokemon since a majority of meta-level tag team GX Pokemon had 270 HP or less. Also, for 2 fire and 2 electric energy, Crossbreak GX dealt 170 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon, plus 170 to a different Pokemon if you played the Ends Resolve supporter card the turn you use the attack. Ends Resolve was a supporter card that directly synergized with the Pokemon and was meant to be played alongside it. When played, Ends Resolve discard the top 6 cards of your deck. Then you attached all basic energy cards you discarded that way to one of your bench Dragon-type Pokemon. This card could either accelerate energy to a player's first Reshiram Zekrom GX to start attacking, or help load up the bench with energy to be discarded. So why exactly did Reshiram Zekrom GX flop at a competitive level? With both good damage output and a means to set up quickly, this card seemed like a no-brainer to be a top meta strategy. The problem with this strategy is that it failed to differentiate itself enough to be worthwhile using over other decks in the competitive metagame. Other decks did what Reshiram Zekrom GX wanted to do, but better, and with no means to stand out amongst the one-hit KO decks, players never gravitated towards Reshiram Zekrom GX. For example, if you wanted to repeatedly use Fabled Firebolt, you needed to attach 3 energies per turn to maximize the damage output. The best ways of doing so were either getting lucky with Ends Resolve, using Welder, or playing Naganadel. The latter was the most reliable means to repeatedly fill the bench with energy, but required multiple Stage 1 Pokemon to be in play. This card had good synergy with Reshiram Zekrom GX, but better cards had more synergy with Naganadel. Blastoise GX was a 2-prize Pokemon that used its Mind Blown attack to put any amount of energy from your Pokemon into the Lost Zone to deal 50 damage per energy. With 6 energy, this attack could one-hit KO any Pokemon. Although Naganadel couldn't recover Lost Zoned energy, the Pokemon in Blastoise being Ultra Beast allowed the deck to leverage the absurdly strong Beast Ring item card that attached 2 energy from your deck to your Ultra Beast. Although this card had a specific timing where it could be used, playing 2 or 3 Beast Ring in a single turn set up enough attackers and energy for the entire rest of the game. Even if you wanted to circumvent the setup required for Naganadel by focusing entirely on setting up damage as quickly as possible with just the 2 supporter cards, the deck was still outclassed by other one-hit KO strategies. Ironically, it was another Blastoise card that was the fastest one-hit KO deck in the format. This card's Fireball Circus attack dealt 50 damage for each fire energy discarded from the hand when using the attack. With Fiery Flint, Fire Crystal, and Giant Hearth in the standard format, it was extremely easy to accumulate enough energy in hand to knock out any Pokemon in the format. This meant the only real setup Blastoise decks needed was Welder to get enough energy in play for Fireball Circus. Being outclassed in so many different metrics meant players just didn't recognize using Reshiram Zekrom GX at large events, leading to it having 0 competitive success during its time in the standard format, despite being a decent card. And at number 7, we have Eevee Snorlax GX. This card has seen the most competitive success in the standard format out of any card on this list, but with hindsight is widely considered to be one of the worst tag team GX Pokemon. For 1 colorless energy, Cheer Up lets you attach an energy from your hand to this Pokemon. For 4 colorless energy, the Dump Trunk Press deals 120 plus 120 more if the defending Pokemon is an evolution Pokemon. Lastly, for 4 colorless energy, Megaton Friends deals 210 damage. Then, if an extra energy card is attached to Eevee Snorlax GX, You draw cards until you have 10 in your hand. Nearly all of this card's success in the standard format came from its inclusion in Reshiram and Charizard GX decks, because this strategy had access to Wailord. This supporter lets you attach up to 3 basic fire energy from your hand to one of your Pokemon, and then draw 3 cards, making it one of the best energy acceleration cards ever printed in the Pokemon TCG. With 2 extra energy attachments every turn, Charizard decks could easily set up an Eevee and Snorlax GX to use either a Dump Truck Press for high damage, or Megaton Friends GX to draw lots of cards. With many Zoroark variants using Slowking to one-hit KO the water-weak Reshiram and Charizard GX, and the occasional Quagsire deck present in the metagame, having access to a colorless attacker that avoided typical means of countering Reshiram decks was for a brief time valuable. However, dodging a bad weakness was the limit of Eevee and Snorlax GX's competitive viability. Once Quagsire and the Zoroark shells supporting Slowking rotated out of the standard format a few months after Wailord was released, Eevee and Snorlax GX immediately fell out of the competitive metagame. All this Pokemon does is damage, and since it requires at least 4 energies to do so, without any water-type decks running around the standard format, there was no reason to play Eevee and Snorlax GX over Charizard, or any other tag team for that matter. Eevee and Snorlax GX's very brief competitive viability was carried by the fact that Charizard's strategies were so powerful that decks which hit it for weakness could exist in the metagame. And at number 6, we have Solgaleo and Lunala GX. For 3 Psychic and 1 colorless energy, Cosmic Burn deals 230 damage and cannot be used during your next turn. Also, for 2 Psychic and 1 colorless energy, Light of the Protector GX dealt 200 damage. Unlike the usual Tag Team GX attacks, this move's bonus effect wasn't dependent on the amount of energy attached. Instead, Light of the Protector got its bonus effect if you play the Lily's Full Force supporter card during the turn you use the attack. If you did, during your opponent's next turn after you use the attack, all of your Pokemon could not be damaged or affected by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon. The main issue with this Pokemon is that its attacks provided very little to no utility outside of dealing big damage. Thankfully, big damage was very important for a Pokemon to have during the tag team era of the TCG, with Cosmic Burn being identical to the meta-defining Reshiram's Flare Strike other than the type of energy required. Solgaleo and Lunala GX even had an excellent partner in Malamar available to accelerate energy and make Cosmic Burn's attack cost trivial. Despite all of this support, Solgaleo and Lunala GX saw very little competitive usage for a very similar to Eevee and Snorlax GX. When all a Pokemon does is big damage, any Pokemon which does more damage will overshadow it. Ultra Necrozma GX was a staple in Malamar decks and had a far higher damage cap. For 1 Psychic and 1 Metal Energy, Photon Geyser deals 20 damage plus 80 more for each basic Psychic Energy you discard from it when you use the attack. If Solgaleo and Lunala GX and Ultra Necrozma GX both have the Cosmic Burn's requisite energy attached, Photon Geyser outdamages the attack by 10. If you can put more than 4 energy in Ultra Necrozma GX, the Pokemon could one-hit KO any attacker in the standard format. If you were playing a Malamar deck and didn't want to include a few Metal Energy, then Solgaleo and Lunala GX could fill the niche of high damage attacker. But many players valued the unlimited damage cap of Photon Geyser over the slight consistency boost from playing only one type of basic energy. The other significant issue affecting Solgaleo and Lunala GX is that players rarely ever use its GX attack for various reasons. Firstly, 200 damage just wasn't that impressive, falling short of knocking out important non-tag team 2-prize Pokemon. Secondly, you'd almost never get the bonus effect of damage prevention, since Lily's Full Force was not a good card due to its obscene downside of forcing you to shuffle all but 2 cards from your hand into your deck at the end of your turn. There was also no guarantee you'd be able to have Lily's Full Force in your hand on a turn you wanted to use Light of the Protector GX. Even if Lily's Full Force was a better card, board-wide damage prevention for a single turn was often not the effect Malamar decks wanted out of their GX attacks. These decks generally wanted to use Gengar and Mimikyu GX's Horror House GX to stop your opponent from playing any cards during the next turn in order to buy time to set up Malamars. Unfortunately for Solgaleo and Lunala GX, the card was often outclassed by Pokemon, which provided more damage and more utility. And at number 5, we have Muk Alolan Muk GX. For a brief period of time, this tag team Pokemon saw experimentation in some Mewtwo and Mew GX decks. For 1 Psychic and 2 colorless energy, Severe Poison poisoned your opponent's active Pokemon and put 8 damage counters on it between turns. Also, for 1 Psychic and 3 colorless energy, Poison Absorption dealt 120 damage and restored 100 damage from Muk Alolan Muk GX if the defending Pokemon was poisoned. Lastly, with no energy cost, Nasty Goo Mix GX poisoned and paralyzed the defending Pokemon. Also, if this Pokemon had 4 extra energy attached, you put 15 damage counters on the poison Pokemon between turns. Although you could play Muk Alolan Muk GX with Malamar, there were far better Psychic Pokemon that could attack for 3 to 4 energy cards to pair with it. And so this tag team card never saw competitive usage as its own standalone deck. Instead, its status-based attacks fit better into various Mewtwo and Mew GX decks. This Pokemon's Perfection ability allowed it to use the attacks of any GX Pokemon on your bench or in the discard pile. In this specific deck, Muk Alolan Muk GX provided a way to attack through damage prevention effects like Keldeo GX's Pure Heart or Latios GX's Tag Purge. These Pokemon couldn't be damaged by Mewtwo and Mew GX, but they still could be poisoned by severe poison. Also, in a pinch, Mewtwo and Mew GX could use Nasty Goo Mix GX to paralyze the defending Pokemon, potentially preventing an attack for a turn if your opponent couldn't find a switch. Unfortunately for Muk and Alolan Muk, this niche of attacking through wall Pokemon was either a problem that could be solved other ways, or didn't need to be solved. Once Auroran Energy released, Mewtwo and Mew GX decks used Greninja's GX Mistlash. Meanwhile, some players didn't even bother including an answer to wall Pokemon since they weren't very played. Muk and Alolan Muk was a card that very nicely fulfilled a specific niche in a meta deck. The problem was many players didn't need that niche filled, and so it's towards the bottom of this list. And at number 4, we have Blastoise Piplup GX. For 2 water and 1 colorless energy, Splash Maker deals 150 damage, and lets you attach up to 3 basic water energy from your hand to your Pokemon in any way you like. Then, for each energy you attach that way, you heal 50 damage from the Pokemon you attached it to. Also, for 2 water and 1 colorless energy, Bubble Launcher GX dealt 100 damage and paralyzed the defending Pokemon. Then, if this Pokemon has 3 excess water energy attached, the attack does 150 more damage. Blastoise Piplup GX is somewhat similar in design to Pikachu and Zekrom GX, with both having 3 energy attack that accelerates up to 3 energy to your Pokemon in any way you like, and a GX attack that helps the deck reach slightly higher damage numbers. So then why was Pikachu and Zekrom GX a meta-defining deck, and Blastoise Piplup GX a card which barely saw any competitive usage? It's all dependent on where the energy acceleration comes from. Pikachu and Zekrom GX will always be able to attach energy since you're far more likely to have 3 or less energy in your deck. Meanwhile, Blastoise and Piplup Splash Maker must attach from your hand. The requirement on energy being in your hand means Splash Maker requires extra setup to be worthwhile. To get any energy acceleration, you have to draw into the energy instead of more useful cards. This downside is why the attack also restores damage from Pokemon you attach to, but this is often not relevant unless you're against the deck spreading damage or attaching energy to your already attacking Pokemon that have taken some damage. It also wasn't easy enough to get enough energy onto Blastoise and Piplup GX to use Splash Maker early in the game when energy acceleration most matters. When comparing to other tag team Pokemon with 3 energy attacks that set up other Pokemon, Pikachu and Zekrom GX and Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia GX, Blastoise and Piplup GX lack the supporting lineup of trainer cards that first had the low-cost utility the latter had. With Tapu Koko Prism Star and Thunder Mountain Prism Star, you could theoretically use full Blitz on your first turn. On turns you couldn't use Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia GX's Ultimate Ray, you could still set up Broken Utility of the Altered Creation GX, boosting your Pokemon's damage by 30, and giving you an extra prize card per knockout before you had 3 energy attached. Blastoise and Piplup GX lacked both a way to speed up Splash Maker or a lower cost attack to use before Splash Maker was enabled, making it very slow for a card whose main purpose was to set up more Pokemon. As a result, if Blastoise and Piplup GX saw any competitive play, it was in Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia GX decks to be a Water-type Pokemon they could put energy from Ultimate Ray onto against Reshiram and Charizard GX, a niche many players didn't care about since the strategy already had a favorable matchup. As a result, Blastoise and Piplup GX saw very little competitive use and earned this spot on this list. And at number 3, we have Slowpoke and Psyduck GX, the first card on this list to have a single notable placement across both the standard and expanded format. For 2 water energy, this Pokemon's Ditch and Splash attack deals 40 damage for each supporter card you discard from your hand when you declare the attack. Also, for 2 water energy, Thrilling Times GX deals 10 damage plus 100 more if you win a coin flip. Also, if this Pokemon has 6 extra water energy attached to it, you flip 10 coins instead and deal 100 for each 1 coin toss. Thrilling Times GX heavy reliance on coin flips, and the 2 Pokemon on this card being Slowpoke and Psyduck, quickly establishes Slowpoke and Psyduck GX as a meme card. However, there is a decent strategy you can build around this card. Two specific cards released alongside Slowpoke Psyduck GX to help bolster the strategy of accumulating supporter cards in hand to discard them for massive damage. The most important of these was Misty's Favor supporter card. When played, you could search your deck for up to 3 supporter cards and put them into your hand. On its own, this card added any supporter needed for a follow-up turn while also directly boosting damage output. If combined with Lieutenant Search's strategy, you could even play one of the Search's supporter cards in the same turn. The second most impactful card released to help Slowpoke Psyduck GX was Lapras. Once per turn, this Pokemon's Mermaid Call ability lets you put a Misty's Favor from your discard pile into your hand. This Pokemon, especially when you had multiple in play, provided consistent access to supporter cards in hand to be discarded by Slowpoke Psyduck's GX attack. These two cards provided a solid base for any player looking to build a Slowpoke Psyduck GX deck, but didn't help alleviate the deck's biggest problem. You had to play a ridiculous amount of supporter cards. If you wanted to one-hit KO the lowest HP tag team Pokemon, Pikachu and Zekrom GX, you had to discard 6 supporter cards, meaning you had to play a lot of them to get to that point. With so many supporters in the deck, Slowpoke Psyduck GX strategies set up very slowly compared to other decks in the metagame. The slow setup speed meant this deck often played from behind, and although this let the deck better leverage Lieutenant Search's strategy and Lance Prism Star for 2 Dragonites, the strategy was prone to getting run over by fast aggressive decks. As a result, Slowpoke Psyduck GX was relegated to being a fun deck instead of a good one. And at number 2, we have Latias Latios GX. The first card on this list to have seen 0 top placements at competitive events. It goes to show the overall power of tag team Pokemon that the first card on this list to have no tournament results on a worst of video is the number 2 card. For 1 water, 2 psychic, and 1 colorless energy, Buster Purge deals 240 damage at the cost of discarding 3 energy attached to the Pokemon. Also, for 1 Psychic Energy, Arrow Unit GX attaches up to 5 basic energy cards from your discard pile to your Pokemon in any way you like. Also, if Latias Latios GX had any extra energies attached to it, all damage and effects of attacks done to this card was prevented during your opponent's next turn. This card sounds like an easy shoo-in for Malamar decks, an archetype we've already discussed in this video. Psychic Recharge easily offsets the main downside of Buster Purge, and in return, you gain access to a high-powered attack that dealt enough damage to one-hit KO Pikachu and Zekrom GX. Unfortunately, just like with Solgaleo and Lunala GX, Latios Latios GX was entirely outclassed by Ultra Necrozma GX's uncapped damage output. Not only does this Pokemon give up 1 less prize card when knocked out, it actually outdamages Buster Purge for the same energy cost. Compared to Buster Purge's 240 damage, a Photon Geyser with 3 basic Psychic Energy attached deals 260 damage. If Latias Latios GX had a better GX attack, it may have maintained some kind of niche over Ultra Necrozma GX, but this was never going to happen when all of Arrow Unit GX provides is more energy acceleration. Malamar already put as much energy as needed into play, so all Arrow Unit GX would amount to it was a wasted GX attack. As a result, Latias Latios GX is one of the 2 tag team GX Pokemon to have seen no competitive success, earning its number 2 spot on this list. And rounding out at number 1, we have Togepi and Cleffa and Igglybuff GX. By far the worst tag team Pokemon in the TCG. For 2 fairy and 1 colorless energy, Rolling Panic lets you flip a coin until you get tails. The attack then does 120 damage plus 30 for each 1 coin flip. For 2 fairy energy, Supreme Puff GX lets you take an extra turn after you use it. Also, if you have a ridiculous 14 extra fairy energy attached to it, you shuffle all of your opponent's bench Pokemon into their deck. This card was very obviously intended to be a bad, funny meme card. Rolling Panic being heavily reliant on coin flips gives a potential limitless damage output, but in practice dealt a very weak 120 damage for 3 energy. Getting an extra turn once per game could be good, but without proper setup and no additional effect, Supreme Puff GX wasn't particularly good. In fact, the only time Togepi and Cleffa and Igglybuff GX would ever be a good card is if you somehow got 16 fairy energies attached to it, at which point Supreme Puff GX won the game on the spot. It is extremely difficult for any deck to keep 16 energy on a board. Not only that, the attack's baffling high cost means almost a third of your deck must be fairy energy, meaning any deck trying to use this very bad card will be prone to bricking on hands full of energy cards and no useful ones. Togepi and Cleffa and Igglybuff GX is in no way a practical card to use, and is by far the worst tag team Pokemon. But if you manage to use the full effect of Supreme Puff GX in a real game, you'll never forget it.